A doctrinal change recently published in the February 2026 edition of the Watchtower magazine has immediately reignited both internal and external debates about how Jehovah's Witnesses interpret the biblical prophecy of peace and security before the Great Tribulation. The organization released this edition on their website ahead of its official distribution date, and for members who have spent decades studying the organization's eschatological timeline, this revision represents more than just a minor adjustment. It fundamentally reshapes the sequence of events they've been taught to anticipate as signs of the imminent end of this system of things. This investigation examines the specific content of that newly released February 2026 publication, compares it meticulously with the traditional teaching that had been firmly established since 2012, and analyzes the theological and historical implications of the revision presented. What we've discovered raises significant questions not only about doctrinal consistency, but about the very nature of prophetic interpretation within a religious organization that claims to speak with divine authority. The changes we're about to explore aren't merely cosmetic. They involve fundamental alterations to visual representations, chronological sequences, and theological logic that millions of Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide have internalized as absolute truth. And perhaps most revealing of all, the language used in this new Watchtower article itself suggests a level of uncertainty that stands in stark contrast to the organization's historically confident assertions about end-times prophecy. The February 2026 edition presents a completely new official image illustrating the proclamation of peace and security, and this visual change is far more significant than it might initially appear. In the Watchtower organization's publications, illustrations are never merely decorative elements. They function as part of the interpretive framework itself, teaching doctrine through visual representation in ways that reinforce and sometimes even define the written teachings. Let's first examine how this prophecy was visually depicted in publications from 2012 through 2025. During this entire period, the official illustrations consistently showed political leaders and religious leaders standing together, aligned in what appeared to be a unified global proclamation. The imagery conveyed a specific message, that this declaration of peace and security would emerge from a coalition between political powers and the world's religious institutions. You could see figures representing different faith traditions alongside governmental authorities, all participating in this prophesied announcement. Now look at what appears in the February 2026 edition. The new image completely removes all religious figures. Gone are the clergy, the religious representatives, the interfaith coalition that had been depicted for over a decade. Instead, only political leaders appear in the illustration, standing alone as they make this declaration. This isn't a subtle modification or artistic reinterpretation. This is a deliberate theological statement presented through visual means. But what does this removal actually signify? According to the accompanying text in the new Watchtower, this visual change suggests something unprecedented in the organization's interpretation, that the declaration of peace and security will occur after the destruction of all religions, not before or during their existence. This represents a fundamental shift in understanding, because it places this prophetic announcement in an entirely different context than members have been taught to expect. This visual revision carries enormous implications. For years, Jehovah's Witnesses have been prepared to watch for signs of political and religious leaders collaborating on some kind of peace initiative. They've been trained to see interfaith cooperation and United Nations peace efforts as potential fulfillments of this prophecy. Now, suddenly, the organization is suggesting that all of that happens in a completely different sequence. The religions will already be gone when this declaration is made. But the revision doesn't stop with the illustration. The February 2026 Watchtower also fundamentally alters the sequence of eschatological events that Jehovah's Witnesses have been taught as established truth since 2012. To understand the significance of this change, we need to clearly lay out both timelines side by side. Here's the traditional timeline that has been taught consistently from 2012 until now. First, political and religious leaders together make the declaration of peace and security. This announcement serves as a false proclamation of stability and safety. Then, immediately following this declaration, the destruction of false religions occurs. This event is described in Watchtower theology as the fall of Babylon the Great, representing all religious organizations except Jehovah's Witnesses. Finally, after the destruction of false religion, the Great Tribulation begins in earnest, culminating in Armageddon. This sequence made a certain internal logic. The false peace declaration becomes the trigger that sets everything else in motion. The political powers, having made this proclamation, then turn on the religious institutions that help them make it. It's a narrative of betrayal and prophetic fulfillment that members could visualize and anticipate. Now examine the revised timeline presented in the February 2026 edition. The sequence has been completely inverted. According to this new interpretation, the destruction of false religions happens first, before any declaration of peace and security. During this destruction, Jehovah's Witnesses supposedly survive while all other religious organizations collapse around them. Only after this massive destruction of religious institutions do political leaders then proclaim peace and security. And presumably, the Great Tribulation continues or intensifies after that declaration. Think about what this inversion means for members who have spent years, even decades, preparing mentally and spiritually for a specific sequence of events. They've been taught to watch for the peace and security announcement as the initial trigger, the first domino that starts everything falling. Now they're being told that massive destruction comes first, and the peace announcement comes afterward, possibly as a response to or result of that destruction. This isn't a minor chronological adjustment. This fundamentally changes what members should be looking for as signs of the end times. It changes how they interpret current events. It changes their entire prophetic framework. And it does so with remarkably little explanation for why the previous understanding, taught with such certainty for 13 years, was incorrect. When we examine this revised timeline more closely, significant theological and logical problems emerge. These aren't obscure academic contradictions. These are fundamental issues that affect the coherence of the doctrine itself. The first major problem involves the very concept of destruction preceding peace. If the declaration of peace and security only comes after the elimination of religions, the implication is clear. The destruction of religions itself somehow results in or enables peace. Think about what this suggests. It means that religious institutions are being portrayed as the primary obstacle to peace, and their removal creates the conditions for this proclamation to be made. But here's where the logic breaks down catastrophically for the organization. In numerous countries around the world, Jehovah's Witnesses themselves are officially classified as a sect, a cult, or a false religion. Russia has banned them as an extremist organization. China doesn't recognize them as legitimate. Many other nations view them with suspicion or outright hostility. So if political powers are going to destroy false religions before making this peace declaration, on what basis would they distinguish Jehovah's Witnesses from all the other religious organizations they're eliminating? The Watchtower has always taught that Jehovah's Witnesses will be miraculously protected during this destruction, that somehow the political powers will recognize them as the one true religion and spare them. But this has never made logical sense from a secular governmental perspective, and it makes even less sense now that the timeline has been reversed. Why would governments destroy all religions, then spare one relatively small sect that many of them already consider problematic, and then declare peace and security as if the problem has been solved? The new interpretation actually places Jehovah's Witnesses in greater theological danger than the old one did. Under the previous timeline, they could claim they'd be protected when governments turned on religions after the peace declaration, because God would intervene at that specific moment. But now, they're claiming they'll survive the initial destruction that precedes the peace declaration, which means they need to explain why secular governments implementing a program of religious elimination would inexplicably skip over them. The second major problem involves the language used in the February 2026 Watchtower itself, and this might be the most revealing aspect of the entire revision. Throughout the article, the organization uses phrases that are strikingly unusual for Watchtower publications. Words and phrases like perhaps, it's possible that, this could occur in this way, appear repeatedly. This hedging language, this uncertainty, stands in stark contrast to the confident, authoritative tone that has characterized Watchtower prophecy interpretation for decades. Anyone familiar with Watchtower publications knows that the organization doesn't typically speak in maybes and possibilities when it comes to prophetic understanding. They present their interpretations as revealed truth, as the product of faithful and discreet slave guidance, as biblical understanding that comes from God's Spirit. But here, in this major doctrinal revision, they're suddenly tentative, uncertain, offering possibilities rather than pronouncements. What does this linguistic shift reveal? It suggests that even the governing body or the writing department isn't entirely confident in this new interpretation. They're floating it, testing it, presenting it as a possibility rather than establishing it as definitive truth. But this creates a profound problem for members who are taught to accept organizational teachings as authoritative. If the organization itself isn't certain, why should members accept this revision as correct? And if this interpretation might change again, what does that say about the previous interpretation that was taught with such certainty? To fully appreciate how far the Watchtower's interpretation has drifted from the biblical text, we need to examine what the Apostle Paul actually meant when he wrote about peace and security in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. Modern biblical scholarship and historical research have uncovered crucial context that the Watchtower consistently ignores or dismisses in its interpretations. The phrase, peace and security, wasn't some generic expression in the first century. It had a very specific political and ideological meaning that Paul's original readers would have immediately recognized. In Latin, the phrase was pax et securitas, and it was one of the primary propaganda slogans of the Roman Empire. This wasn't obscure language. It appeared on coins minted throughout the empire. It was inscribed on monuments and public buildings. It showed up in official documents and imperial proclamations. The Roman Empire used this slogan to promote a specific message about the stability and safety that Roman rule supposedly provided. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was celebrated as an unprecedented period of security and prosperity brought about by imperial power. Citizens were encouraged to trust in this peace, to see Roman authority as the guarantor of their safety, to believe that the empire had ushered in an era of unprecedented stability. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonian Christians about people saying peace and security, he was almost certainly referencing this specific Roman propaganda. He was warning his readers not to be deceived by imperial claims of stability. He was saying that when the empire and its supporters proclaim that everything is safe and secure under Roman rule, that's precisely when sudden destruction will come upon them unexpectedly, like labor pains on a pregnant woman. This was a warning with immediate relevance to first-century Christians living under Roman occupation. Paul was telling them not to trust in imperial propaganda, not to be lulled into complacency by official assurances of peace and security. This was about their contemporary political reality, not about some global announcement thousands of years in the future involving the United Nations, world religious leaders, or a modern Armageddon scenario. The Watchtower's interpretation extrapolates this first-century warning about Roman propaganda into an elaborate end-times prophecy involving specific sequences of global events, political coalitions, and religious destructions. There's no indication in Paul's text that he was describing anything beyond his own historical context. The sudden destruction he warned about was the coming judgment on the Roman system, not a detailed timeline of events millennia later. And now, with the February 2026 revision, the organization has altered this already questionable interpretation yet again, moving pieces around on the prophetic chessboard without ever acknowledging that the entire game might be based on a fundamental misreading of what Paul actually wrote and why he wrote it. Each revision, each change in the timeline, each new interpretation only highlights how far removed these teachings are from the actual biblical text and its historical context. The February 2026 Watchtower introduces changes that affect multiple levels of organizational teaching and practice. It alters the official iconography that members have relied on for visual understanding of prophetic events. It completely reorganizes the prophetic sequence that has been taught as established truth for over a decade. It creates new logical contradictions within the internal structure of the doctrine itself. And perhaps most significantly, it exposes the enormous distance between the biblical text in its historical context and the elaborate interpretive framework the organization has constructed. The removal of religious leaders from the illustration isn't just an artistic choice. It represents a fundamental shift in how members are supposed to understand the role of religion in end-times events. The inversion of the timeline doesn't merely adjust when things happen. It changes what members should be watching for, preparing for, and expecting. The appearance of uncertainty in the language, those unusual phrases of possibility and speculation, reveals cracks in the authority structure that members have been taught to accept without question. When we step back and compare this new interpretation to what biblical scholars understand about Paul's original meaning, we see a pattern that is repeated throughout Watchtower history. The organization takes a biblical text, extrapolates it far beyond its original context, builds an elaborate interpretive structure, teaches that structure as divine truth, and then periodically revises that structure when reality doesn't cooperate with the predictions. Each time, members are expected to accept the new understanding as if it had always been obvious, while the failed predictions and abandoned interpretations are quietly forgotten. The February 2026 revision is the latest chapter in this ongoing pattern. It demonstrates that after more than a century of claiming special insight into biblical prophecy, after decades of confident assertions about the sequence and nature of end-times events, the organization still doesn't have a stable, consistent interpretation of even core prophetic texts. The timeline shifts, the illustrations change, the certainty wavers, and millions of faithful members are left wondering whether the prophetic framework they've devoted their lives to understanding has any reliable foundation at all. For those watching from outside, this revision offers a revealing glimpse into how prophetic interpretation actually functions within high-control religious organizations. It shows how visual elements, textual changes, and linguistic shifts all work together to create and recreate doctrinal understanding. It demonstrates how uncertainty can be introduced even within systems that demand absolute acceptance. And it illustrates how historical and biblical scholarship consistently challenges the elaborate interpretive structures that such organizations construct, revealing the distance between ancient text and modern application, between what was actually written and what believers are taught to see.